Alrighty. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate everybody hopping on this professional development. Uh, today's event is progressing past the barriers, issues that halt inclusion and belonging. My name is Daniel Roberts. I am the coordinator of event management, and I'm also a Title IX investigator.
Hey, everybody. So happy to be with you all today. My name is Desmond Davis. I'm the Assistant Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Alfred State College, and I am also a Title IX investigator.
All right, so let's begin. So, microaggressions, the bad and the ugly. There's nothing good about microaggressions. We all have our own form of microaggressions. We address different kinds that can affect the organizations and institutions of diversity and inclusion realm. Our objectives for today. We're going to explain what microaggression and the impacts within athletics, explain forms of bias that allows microaggression to become common, discuss practical steps and ways these issues can be avoided, and provide resource materials to aid future learning. So different types of microaggressions. Let's see. Sorry about that. So microaggressions. So they could be intentional or unintentional. Microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional. Statements, actions, or indecencies of discrimination against a targeted group. Subtle or harmful actions directed to targeted groups. So it could be something that's small, subtle, but be very impactful and damaging. Our biases can cause these microaggressions. So imagine stepping on a Lego, like a Lego. If you have kids, the little toys, maybe a little needle, or you bumped your toe in the corner of a desk or something. And even though it's something small, but it hurts you really bad, that's the same thing when we say subtle but harmful actions directed at a targeted group. So we got verbal, behavioral, and environmental. Verbal is things we say when we speak. Behavioral is our actions, things we do. And environmental is our environment. So if our population consists of people of color, women, differently able, religious minorities, LGBTQ+, then our administration should somewhat resemble that population that we're serving. Targeted groups that were affected. So we have people of color, women, differently able community, religious minorities, and LGBTQ. Now, there are other groups as well. So you have your social economic, hierarchy and administration. And then, so when I say hierarchy and administration, our objectives as administrators is to be serving leaders to our staff, our faculty, and our organization. Also, to reach out and pull our employees up to become future leaders. Forms of microaggression. So we have micro assaults, which is best known, it's pretty much your old-fashioned racism. So most people who use micro assaults will say that they're not trying to be intentional with their actions or be harmful. The person will not openly say they're acting in a discriminatory way. A very common example of a micro assault is someone telling a racist joke and then say, "I was only kidding." Micro insults. These occur when people unintentionally and unconsciously say discriminatory things or behave in a discriminatory way. When people communicate micro insults, they may believe that they're complimenting the person, but however, they're actually making an insulting statement. An example of that would be complimenting someone on their good English or proper grammar. Most micro insults are commonly unintentional. And then finally is micro invalidations. These are actions and behaviors that deny racism and other forms of discrimination. Invalidations occur when a person undermines the struggle of a targeted group. So racism, sexism, and other bigotry is presented in society today. And people who believe that doesn't exist negate reality. An example of a micro invalidation is saying something like, racism doesn't exist, or, well, I don't see color. And sometimes people may try to use religion to validate that statement. So in that picture, next picture, this is Cassandra. Her name is Dr. Cassandra Owens Rodriguez. She's Venezuelan. Cassandra's from Long Island. Cassandra's a lesbian. Cassandra's pronouns are she and her. She's also differently able, as she is dyslexic. Cassandra has her PhD in sports administration, and her job title is assistant AD at Normal University, which is a Division III school. So this is an example we're going to use today. So Cassandra, she might hear something saying, "You are so articulate." Well, while these words are complementary, depending on the tone and content of these comments, can feel condescending, as people of color aren't expected to have full command of their own language. This statement can be an assumption that a person cannot articulate themselves. Don't compliment on the grammar or language. Compliment on the presentation itself. Where are you really from? So Latinx and Asian professionals and students often deal with this kind of microaggression. In most cases, people of color will tell you where they're from. It's not fair to a Latinx American who may be a third generation student or professional to be asked this question. Yeah, their family may be from Venezuela, but he, she, they may be born in Long Island and be from Long Island. By using this kind of microaggression, you're creating that othering effect, which makes an individual feel like they don't belong in the dominant group. When I look at you, I don't see color. This goes back to my previous slide of microvalidation. The moment of uncomfortable silence when you utter those words, you don't see color. Well, you don't see me. I don't see color. Can feel like I'm choosing to ignore this part of you because it makes me feel more comfortable. It sounds like I don't see you, and it may feel like a casual dismissal. I identify as a straight Black male who happens to be dyslexic. It is a part of who I am. Is it all of me? No. But refusing to see the color is disregarding the distinct beauty that people of color may bring to the table. You look too young to be a manager. Well, plain and simple. In athletics, we have young professionals who are rising and getting higher administrative positions in a faster rate than normal because of their work ethic. We shouldn't be commenting how someone looks at all when they're advancing up to another position that most people are used to seeing over time. It might take a while for someone to become an assistant AD or athletic director. Then you got somebody that's younger that's already become an assistant AD at a quicker pace than you probably have dealt with in your past. Just comment on comment on their work ethic. They've been working hard to get to this point, so let's show them that respect. Next one, why are you getting so angry and emotional? Well, this is known as tone policing. Tone policing is focused on how something is said, ignoring whether or not it is true. People of color are accused of being overly animated and during the discussion. Desmond could suggest the idea, be passionate or trying to make a point, and can be accused of being aggressive or angry. If a colleague of mine who's not a person of color echoes the same suggestion, for some reason, the idea is considered a good idea. Statements like this suggest that people of color don't have the right to become animated, excited, frustrated, express other authentic emotions without being perceived as threatening or creating a negative impression. This microaggression pushes people of color away while creating tension within the administration and institution. Women are often accused of being emotional as well and angry as well because they're being passionate about something. This has become very problematic statement for years. And we're seeing women as becoming better, not just leaders, but they're becoming amazing leaders. They already are amazing leaders. And we're seeing more and more leaders in administration right now. And one of the most used comments that we hear is, "My boss is crazy." Well, your boss is not crazy. She's passionate. She's not being emotional. And try to understand why she's being passionate before you make statements like this. Sometimes men can be accused of being emotional, as our society is slowly understanding our mental health. Men are susceptible to be emotional, to show authentic emotions and not try to hide behind a tough interior. One of the things that you'll see is sometimes you'll have other colleagues who are men try to say, "Hey, stop being soft, man up." or some kind of physical action to measure how masculine someone is. When that happens, you're indulging in toxic masculinity, creating a toxic culture. How's everything going, Lisa? Now, this seems like a pleasant question, but it may be considered microaggression, as her name is Cassandra, as I said before. When there's only a handful of people of color on campus and they're constantly being mistaken for one another, this mistake sends the message that they're not being viewed as individuals as much as a member of a group. Frequently, the people of color don't resemble each other, and this, which reinforces that they're simply being seen as one of the Black people, or one of the Latinx people, or one of the Asian people. When people don't get the sense that you truly see them for who they are, it's hard to build trust. Take the time to remember people's names. Yes, but, well, I think. This is a very well-known one at a meeting. So individuals tend to disregard others' ideas and take credit for someone else's ideas. This is typically done towards women in the workplace. If you're a woman or racial minority, chances have you have been interrupted at some point or talked over by a colleague in a meeting. Circumstances often is referred to as mansplaining. Mansplaining is when someone explains something that another person about a topic that they are already familiar with and understand, but they want to take the credit. This is typically done in a condescending way, understanding that pretense that the speaker knows more about the topic than that they're speaking about, i.e. they're being subordinate. Oh, you're a lesbian. My friend is a lesbian too. Let me introduce you to her. This is a classic suggestion that many well-intentioned straight people pull out for LGBTQ+. Co-workers, their friends, their family are often to set them up with other LGBTQ+ that they know. Just because two people know one thing in common or have something in common does not mean that they're a match. Yes, there are fewer he, she, they can date, but it doesn't mean that he, she, or they don't have standards and personality, values, and everything else that we care about. This is what would be like setting up a straight coworker with a random straight person of the opposite gender. Just because they happen to be same orientation does not mean that it's going to work out. If your coworker has is of any sexual orientation and wants your help meet new people, they'll just ask you. Now, so to the next thing. So reactions to microaggressions. So you have mental health issues. Some mental health effects of microaggressions may include depression, anxiety, suicide, and alcohol-related problems. Then you have feeling undervalued. So people who feel undervalued from microaggressions may prevent people in targeted groups from applying for jobs, negotiating salaries, and striving for promotions. Then you got tension at work. Projects are not being completed in a timely manner. The individual doesn't feel confident to speak up about their ideas that can advance the department. Awkwardness. So if I'm walking down the hall and I see you, I have to turn my head because I'm afraid to talk to you because we don't get along. Then you have resignation of a position. Most people will continue their jobs because they have to put food on the table. They have to pay bills. But sometimes if this particular microaggressions is affecting the individual's mental health, then they may leave the position or they might leave the institution because they're no longer comfortable. And we all want to be comfortable where we work at. And then finally, the conversation with legal counsel. So this is the final step. Usually most people, if they're dealing with microaggressions to the point where it's affecting their work ability to work, they will speak to their HR. Now, if HR doesn't do anything to rectify this, because sometimes, especially athletic administration, the people we usually go to is our boss, which could be the AD or the person that's in charge of us. If nothing's being done and you already went to HR, you went to your boss, then the next step is legal counsel. So they might talk to lawyers, judicial. They might, they're going to probably get in the process of trying to sue because at this point, we're not doing anything to help this individual who's dealing with these microaggressions. So the perfect thing is to make sure that anybody that's dealing with it, make sure you take notes of everything, the conversations, because eventually, if you are dealing with these microaggressions, you want to have some kind of documentation. Excuse me. So now I talked about microaggressions and the types of microaggressions, reactions to microaggressions. Now I'm going to talk about how to combat microaggressions. Microaffirmations. They're small acts which are often hard to see, events that are public and private, conscious and unconscious, but very effective, which occur whenever people wish to help succeed. Wherever, excuse me. This is an opportunity for leaders and our peers to become social disruptors. Social disruptors is about people, organizations, the bold actions that break the status quo to create a positive change in the workplace, which is not very common, but just enough. From a conference standpoint, our commissioners to our athletic directors, to associate ADs, to assistant ADs, to directors, to coordinators, to coaches, and to administrative assistant. Each program introduces a social disruptor and explores the work that they're doing to make an impact. Now, there's different types of microaffirmations that you could do. So you can open doors to opportunities. So invite someone to a business meeting or a network event, introduce them to to the president, or introduce them to somebody else to give them a chance to get that opportunity. Put them on a project that with a committee or a particular group. Show inclusion and caring. Stop by someone's office for a chat, socialize with them, get to know them about their life outside of work. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be their best friend, but at least get to know the people that you're working with. You never know what could be going on. And sometimes when we portray these microaggressions, because at some point in our life, everybody has portrayed some form of microaggressions. You never know what's going on in individual's life. And that's why I talked about the reaction microaggression, because you're affecting that individual's mental health when you do something that is some form of microaggression. Listen, invite someone to speak. Pay attention to their words. Ask thoughtful questions. Give credit. Make sure people's contributions are known and acknowledged. And then offer support. So stand up for people when they're not being discredited or demeaned. In higher education, people of color, differently able, LGBTQ+, women tend to have a hard time advancing unless they are in diversity, equity, and inclusion field, or in a particular position that's designated for them. If people of color is often looking to events, there's an opportunity to assist them, as simple as a title change or a chance for them to do more to boost their chances. So like putting them on that committee, putting them on that, give them that particular project. Offer support and understand why they need that support. And then finally, provide feedback. Help everyone to recognize and build their strengths to overcome weaknesses. Now, remember, there's no limit to the test for microaggressions. What may be considered a microaggression can vary from person, situation, level of relationship, delivery tone, history, context, and other factors. Educate yourself on microaggressions. Avoid making those comments and doing actions that's considered common microaggressions. Talk to your peers. Make positive attempts to get to know them, allow them to get to know you. Remember, like I said, show inclusion by caring. Do not fall in that trap of clamoring around, almost like tying up when you're around those particular groups who are targeted with the fear of saying the wrong thing. Be authentic. Be open to learning. If you're not confident whether you might be saying something that's offensive, express that concern. Most people are very will respond well if you are open and authentic about your actions. But first, we must acknowledge our personal biases, which is causing these microaggressions. And I think, and Desmond will explain more about these biases.
Thanks, Dan. Real quick, it's so important how you were saying when we're dealing with microaggressions and we're dealing with that form, that we keep in mind that's such behavior, such tendencies, they originate from somewhere, right? And so if we look at microaggressions as let's say, a tree, right? Then the roots would really be the biases that we have. And again, before we even get into the thing of biases, I know sometimes, there's the concept and in the term bias kind of has been dragged through the mud a little bit, and we've had different groups and people who really try to shoot down this idea of bias or claim that they don't have bias. The reality is we all have bias, right? Bias really is just the tendencies that we create, and it helps us really as a tool to process information faster, right? So the jokes that you may have with your family, or the way that you're able to interact amongst your circle, you take less time to think of it, right? That's a shortcut, a mental shortcut that you've used to establish a closeness with people or family or loved ones. The issue, though, is when we're looking at bias from a cognitive place, right? Psychologists, they often look at bias, and when they're talking about how we go about processing this information, the issue we find is that when we're using these shortcuts with hope of getting to one destination, when really we're trying to go somewhere else. Have you ever been like driving in a car and maybe you are on your way somewhere and it's just kind of like second nature that if you know that you have to go to the post office, you have to get onto this road, but for whatever reason, you might need to stop at a friend's house this time, but you're taking that same pathway, right? And you make the right to go to the post office when you know you should have made the left, but you're just so used to, this particular trip leading to that particular destination. Well, bias works in the same way because it's that tendency and that shortcut. The issue we run into, though, as people is when bias begins to have damaging effects because we're using these shortcuts with the wrong people, right? We're trying to give our brain a break because our brain is processing information 24/7. And again, I'm talking with people here in athletics. You already know, I'm sure many of you are probably former and even current athletes that you've experienced, the quick reaction you need to have to be successful in a particular sport. The split second decision making you need, whether as a coach or as an athlete. And those are skills that you've carried with you even into your administrative and your professional world. But what we have a problem is that these can lead to damaging effects. These can be effects like the behaviors in which we have. If somebody happens to be different than us, the treatment of others, if they necessarily don't fit what would be considered our circle, our in crowd, whether or not we include or exclude people, right? So many of these things can lend itself to bias. Bias can be at the root of it. Stories we tell ourselves and others as to what's happening in our social world, right? Either as it pertains to ourselves or other people, right? So we just finished an election, and a lot of the things that we use to make decisions were things that we use to inform our thought process and really strengthen our bias. So if we're applying this now in terms of how we operate within a athletic administrative place, as coaches, as athletes, or just as people in general, right? We can really break this down into a couple forms of bias. So starting out, we're working with the self-serving bias. Okay. And again, for the sake of today's discussion, we're only going to look at really two. So the self-serving bias, essentially, this is our tendency, and it's quite a common tendency, to attribute our success to our own personal characteristics, things that we feel make us, special, anything that's positive, we attribute to something about us. And the interesting thing about this is that the total opposite is the case for us. That if something negative happens, we attribute it to kind of just situations that are just outside of our control. And the reason why we tend to do this as a bias is because it helps our ego, it helps our self-esteem, and it's really like a form of defense mechanism, right? And if you think about this a little bit, you can probably start imagining how this can kind of serve detrimental in an administrative practice, right? When we're trying to be inclusive and we think about, okay, what are these barriers that are halting progression? What are these barriers that are halting inclusion and belonging, right? The things we tell ourselves about others and ourselves can be a key reason that we're halting right now. A second one I wanted to focus on is the fundamental attribution error, right? So hear me out. So basically this overestimates someone's behavior based on internal factors to them, right? So basically, the thing we do to save face, to save ego, this defense mechanism that we have, this bias, right, for the self-serving bias, it actually works the opposite when we're dealing with other people. So if something is wrong regarding someone, maybe they're having issues with getting reports on time, we'll assume based off of this bias here that it's because there is something fundamentally wrong with them. And we will completely ignore all outside factors that would potentially argue otherwise, right? So maybe it's not that they're struggling with being on time. Maybe it's that their office seems to have a little bit slow internet, right? My friend Dan, he was in his office and his internet was moving a little slow. And so, right, if I wasn't cognizant of that, I could potentially be operating in fundamental attribution error and say, nah, bro, you're just not like ready or prepared. When that wasn't the case. It was he had an internet issue. So we worked it out and he's in his other office now where the bookcase and stuff are, right? So we made a quick change. But if we're not taught these things, if we're not working on these things, then we can potentially do more damage than good. So real quick, I want to give us an example here, okay? So I love using examples because I think it helps us kind of hit things home and really kind of makes this more applicable for us. So this is Shanice, right? So she just recently graduated from college and she is in grad school right now. So she is a GA. Anybody went to grad school, y'all know being a GA is tough because you're doing a lot of hours, you're doing a lot of work, and you're trying to get your master's degree or whatever further education you're trying to do. And she's a GA, and she's a GA for, let's say, volleyball. So she's a GA for the volleyball team, and she's helping with coaching. She's helping with workouts and stuff like that because she aspires to be a coach herself one day. And so Shanice has had kind of an issue really where she's having a hard time kind of getting to the coaches meeting on time. She's usually like a couple minutes late, nothing crazy, maybe like 5 minutes, but we notice that this seems to be a trend, right? Now, what the fundamental attribution error, right? This bias, again, that's common for all of us, would argue is that we would be more likely to assume there's just something wrong with her. There's just some issue that she just cannot put together and the time and the proper planning she needs so that she can be on time, right? So that she can be successful. We are so more likely to think that compared to the fact that because she's working on a college campus, maybe it's a bigger institution, maybe she gets out of class like right after the coaches meeting, or maybe the professor takes liberty, right? Because we know professors will do that, and they'll hold the class longer than what the scheduled time is. And now she's racing back to try to get here to get to the meeting on time, right? Maybe it's a situation where if you're like us and you're in Western New York, it snows year round. Here in Alfred, the weather is pretty much this: winter, spring, winter, winter, mini summer, winter, winter, with a little bit of fall sprinkled in. And so maybe the sidewalk is icy, and that sidewalk or that route to the meeting would be the quickest, but maybe facilities hasn't got a chance to get to that one because it's not within their time schedule. So they usually get to it after she would need it, right? And so we're less likely to ask if that's a potential concern or a potential issue. And we're more likely to think that, oh, you probably just have something wrong. You need to be a better planner. You need to have better time management, right? Or maybe we can put a good face on it. We're like, oh, we totally understand, but we're still thinking these things, right? And what we say can help dictate what we do, but oftentimes our thoughts become our true intentions and our true actions. So can you see kind of how this can become sort of an issue for us in an administrative place? If we're looking at athletics, if we're looking at college, if we're looking at businesses, how this can potentially become a problem. Can you imagine how this can affect our hiring processes? Can you imagine how this can affect appointments and people who we place in rooms and in positions of leadership? This can become very problematic. So again, we are more likely to overestimate someone's lack of motivation and underestimate social conditions, right? I was sitting in on a talk via YouTube for a panel, and there were a number of speakers who were talking. And one of the things they talked about was just how much they have to be cognizant of the fact of in some sports, you won't find as much representation. And that struck me, and I had to stop and I had to think, because I went to a public school. I'm from the Pittsburgh, PA area, right? Go Steelers, go Penguins, go Pirates. You know, I always got to throw that in there just in case if Mike Tomlin's watching and he wants me to speak for him. But I thought about that as a public institution, as a public school I went to in high school, and just the lack of sports that we didn't have, that weren't available to us because of funding or things like that. And I thought about how then this can carry over, that when we get to higher education, when we're getting into places of college sports and college athletics, what this may look like for our representation, right? We're often told that this idea of like the sport golf being traditionally more of a white sport, because some schools don't necessarily, whether it's due to weather, whether it's due to equipment or whatever, or even ice hockey or things like that, may not be available in places where it might be more urban, more public schools, which then could lead to lesser funding. And so we're thinking about all of these type of conditions that can lead to these shortcomings that we deal with, right? And if we're willing, matter of fact, I don't want to say willing, but if we're able to sometimes underestimate the social conditions of sports and representation on a big scale like that, then how much more on passing conversations? How much more in professional relationships do we might underestimate some of these social conditions that our peers and our colleagues are dealing with? How much more do we underestimate the challenge that people who are minoritized, right? I don't like to necessarily use the word minority, because oftentimes the reasons and the things that make us minorities are things that are outside of our control, but more because of a social structure and a system. So we're more minoritized in nature, right? Who, like, when we stop and think about these things that minoritized professionals are dealing with and these social conditions that they're dealing with, do we take these into account when we're looking at performance programs, when we're looking at something that I want to talk about, like mentoring? So another bias I want to talk about real quick is this similar to me effect, right? So this bias refers to our tendency to be very partial and more than fair and very inviting and encouraging to people who hold similar tendencies and similar characteristics and traits to us, right? Because at the end of the day, we love people who are just like us. You know what I mean? I love being around Steeler fans, right? Compared to being around Ravens fans or Bengals fans, my Lord, or anything like that, right? Because I like people who are like me. The issue that we run into is, though, this can lead to major problems within a professional setting, right? Because these biases, like the similar to me effect, this can lead to othering and siloing professionals who necessarily don't relate to us. This could then lead to loss of access to social networks, mentoring, right? Mentoring is huge within any type of profession. Studies have shown that where there are organizations that have what's the word, informal mentoring programs compared to institutions that have informal mentoring. So in other words, places where they have it built into their structure that you have to have a mentor and it'll be assigned to you and stuff. The studies have shown that formal mentoring programs yield about as much benefit and yield about as much success as not having a mentorship program at all, right? So the power is in informal mentoring. The power is in making these meaningful relationships. But if we're only working with folk who have similarities to us, or if we're only working with folk who might look different than us, right? But they're willing to assimilate and fit our culture, which necessarily isn't even a business culture as much as it is more of a social culture, as much as it is more of an identity culture, right? Where you think like us, you make us as comfortable as possible with your different, right? If people aren't willing to do that, then they don't necessarily get access to these mentorship opportunities, right? How many amazing athletic directors have not received an opportunity or a shot because they necessarily didn't assimilate, right? Because they might have been different somewhere outwardly, but because that difference might have made us uncomfortable, right? We weren't willing to work through the stuff that we have to work through, our bias, right? To make that connection, to bring up those future leaders who will make major strides and push athletics forward or push business forward, right? So because of these biases, this then leads again to a lack of social network, which then can damage educational goals if we're looking at GAs or undergrad students, right? And then this leads to then potential damage to career outcomes. And we may not even think like, okay, that, Desmond, you might be kind of stretching it a little bit there, but that's how it starts, right? Isn't the age-old saying, it's not what you know, but who you know? So if it's based off of who you know, but we already have these issues that we're working through, these biases that are siloing us, right? And these divisions that we have present very clearly within our country, then how much more in a business setting where we may have more control and more say over things, right? But if we're not willing to check our bias and do the deep work, the reflection work, and all those things needed to help make us successful, right? We can be furthering these divisions. Lastly, these biases, right? They can lead to a limit of access regarding information, insight, expertise, and influence. It could be little things like not inviting that different person to lunch, right? It could be the little things like not getting not forwarding emails, or we've all experienced where there's like something that maybe the college president or somebody has sent down, or your CEO or your executive board or whatever sent down in an email or a memo, and sometimes it doesn't get to everybody, or some of us might have like 200 unread emails in our email account, and that's only from one day, so we might miss that, right? But if we're not in the group, and if there's not an effort to include, right, even those people who are considered the other, right, then they lose access to information, which then that can lead to people looking like they don't know what's going on when they necessarily don't have that cover that another person might have because that other person's in the in crowd. Meanwhile, the different person is still kind of siloed, right? So I wanted to really just get through that really quick, because I wanted to take the next 20 minutes or so to really just engage in some dialogue and some questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing. We do have sources and stuff about some of the things that we were talking about, because we always want to back what we're saying, and we'll be glad to share that with anybody who would like to know. But if you want to, and again, challenge by choice, if you'd be willing maybe even to turn your camera on, and we can take these last 20 minutes, kind of just have a discussion, a dialogue. And if you have questions, let's say that you may not be comfortable asking because it's recording, the last 10 minutes, we'll turn the recording off so we can have some real deep like Q&A and have some real dialogue too. But any questions that anybody would want to ask now? Thanks for turning your camera on, Mary. Appreciate it. I think you're muted, by the way. I'm not sure if you had a question.
I actually.
Oops.
You're still muted.
Could you?
I'm sorry, I don't know why. I'll say, don't have a question. I just said, this has been great. Thank you.
Oh.
Appreciate the information. You know, sometimes you know, when you're doing things for so long, you know, I've been at the university for a while, you often forget. For me, a weakness has been one of the earlier points that you pointed on. We have so many students and I'm not good with anybody's name. So helping me to slow down and to remember names, especially in athletics when they have all kinds of nicknames, something I want to really challenge myself. And I think the struggle with remote learning now has even furthered the disconnect and the miscommunication, and you know, struggling a lot myself. So I can't imagine how the students struggle. So I appreciate this information.
Definitely.
Thank you.
I mean, but you're so right though. It's so common, I think, for us that we can kind of forget some of the nuances, right? I think part of what makes any professional a good professional is the ability to have nuance and understand that not everything is just always the same cut, dry, rinse and repeat, right? You're not going to meet necessarily the same student, right, every single time. And in these systems and stuff, we try to work the best we can to get as many in and out and student athletes and stuff and make sure, you know, we're practicing winning culture and all that stuff. And that's all well and good, but we have to be willing to do kind of the deeper work. And so that's a great point. Someone just turned their camera on. Angel?
Angel. Hey, Angel. Long time no see.
Hi. I really only turned my camera on because I didn't realize it wasn't on initially until that. So I apologize for being.
All good. Did you have a question?
I didn't have a question, so to speak. I liked the presentation. I was also wondering about the ability to have some expansion on this for individuals to figure out ways in which from a department level they can have dialogue and conversation with people to bring more awareness. Your point around the language of implicit biases is difficult for people to receive. So how you're creating common language within at least your department to begin to address some of these conversations.
Not to kind of like over commandeer the conversation, Dan, but is it okay if I tackle this one?
Yeah, you go ahead. I'll let you take this one.
Angel, I so appreciate that question. And that's why if you see, I kind of stayed away from things regarding like implicit bias, the implicit association test, right? For a couple of reasons, right? One, because of like the low retest reliability. If somebody would take like an implicit associations test, right? You can kind of learn how to kind of scam the system. So I would say, and I'd be happy to send these slides to you as well too. That's why I selected some of the type of biases that we used here, because these things I would argue can kind of hit everybody. And then I would think some of the steps you can do departmentally is to encourage discussion, is to encourage people who seem to have an interest, right? Kind of find some of your like initial yes people and then encourage them, again, to the best of our abilities, to find a topic, find a particular piece of this work that they would like to tackle, and then work and collaborate with folk who they usually wouldn't want to work with or not their usual suspects, right? Because whenever we want to do something, we silo, we like to work with our usual suspects and we kind of just stick with the team and stick with those folk. But when we encourage and establish kind of this precedent to work with different people, even if they're in different departments, right? Even if it's and I don't say like even to like look down on, but like even if it's somebody from facilities, whoever, right? Encourage the team to kind of collaborate with other folk outside of the department and outside of the office. One of the things my chief diversity officer did was she had us establish a list of like our most trusted people who we talk to and who we work with, right? And then she took those names off the table of people who we could have these discussions with and these dialogues with, which then made us kind of have to build new relationships and to kind of tackle these things, right? I I think also sometimes top-down initiatives really help. Sometimes you might need to get that initial buy-in, and I'm not sure what and kind of like what your position and what you do is, but if you're the one who can make the top-down decision, I think that would also very much help and kind of find that buy-in in there. Dan, did you have anything, bro?
No, you said it perfectly, man. I'm not even gonna overstep that statement. That was pretty good.
Oh, thanks, bro. Angel, did that help? I hope I wasn't talking in circles.
No, not talking in circles at all. I think it's helpful for everyone to hear some steps as far as things you can do in a tangible way to actually bring all of this full circle.
Yeah, yeah. And benchmarking, right? When we set goals and when we set timestamps on like when we're trying to achieve things, right? Even if we don't fully achieve it, the benchmarking and the timestamps for me has helped make these goals more real and not just lofty things. And being specific, right? We're not going to solve every problem in one day. So be as specific as we can, and let's then measure that, and then let's then assess that and rinse and repeat. And it's kind of those little bits of like being strategic and intentional in these little things that then can give way to, I think, big change. Because sometimes we just want to push like lofty goals like, oh, we're going to be diverse and inclusive. Okay, well, what does that mean? Are we just going to, I said diverse and inclusive and my phone went off and said Google. But what does that mean? Are we talking like, okay, are we talking like have more people of color, have more women? Are we talking diversity of thought, right? Because maybe your goal is like you're working on something that deals with parenting, right? Maybe you might have a really diverse group of people from all walks of life, nationalities, sexual orientations, and everything, but none of them have been parents before. So now we're talking about diversity compared to diversity that's trying to meet a goal. You know what I mean? And so when we're trying to be more specific, we have a greater chance of success in trying to avoid kind of the lofty, like surface, like try to catch all type goals, because it usually tends not to work sometimes. Yeah. Did somebody else turn their camera on, bro?
Is it Nan?
Or Nan?
Nan?
And
Hi, how are you?
Or how you doing?
I had to come late, so I was just trying to be, well, not that late. I've been on for a few minutes, but I don't have a question though. I'll listen to the recording.
It's okay.
Awesome.
We'll also take time to afterwards too. So if you definitely have any questions and you're not comfortable asking these questions through the presentation, we'll leave our email address. You can contact us, and we'll take time to talk to you, whether it's through Zoom or do a phone call, through email. So we'll leave that in the chat for you guys.
Yeah. What we're going to do is probably, since we're about to have 10 minutes left, we'll stop the recording here. Julie, is that okay to do that?